What if we understood how to, let's say, in those kind of coherent meditative states, actually address some of the early, let's say, attachment wounding? Because if you understand the causes of suffering from a Western psychological perspective, you understand a lot of it is like early childhood. So the problem with the great traditions is they didn't study that. They studied like advanced states. However, what the fourth turning shows you is actually there's a relationship between the advanced states and the early childhood injuries. And when you redesign the contemplative practices, that you're taking the force of the meditation and helping to heal that, like those very early injuries. Imagine what happens when you do that in the unified field, that you're not just kind of creating higher states in the unified field, but you're also creating inherently integrative states that help the psyche, the human psyche on a planetary level, kind of integrate a lot of the trauma that we haven't been able to process, and that spirituality, so to speak, hasn't been able to touch because it's been too high.
Have you ever wondered how your personal growth could contribute to healing the earth? Well, in this episode, we explore Planetary Dharma with Dr. John Churchill, who guides us through the profound connection between human consciousness and the planet's evolution. You'll discover how heart centered awareness, rather than ego driven actions, can foster both personal and collective healing, aligning our spiritual development with the Earth's natural rhythms. Dr. Churchill introduces the fourth turning, a pivotal moment in human history where heart intelligence becomes the key to navigating global challenges. So get ready to gain practical insights into how contemplative practices can stabilize heart coherence, deepen your self awareness, and empowers us to co create a future of collective awakening and planetary alignment. So, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, depending on which side of the planet you are on at this very moment. We have another amazing guest for you. We have Dr. John Churchill. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure. It's good to be here.
Yes, and I got up at 4 o'clock in the morning this morning because it is 6 o'clock in the morning, and I was really super excited. So I was jumping out of bed knowing that you were coming on the show. So I'm really grateful. And I know it's your afternoon, oh, your tea time, your afternoon. Uh, John, the way that we love to start the show is we always love to ask our guest, what inspired you to do what you do today?
Oh, well, um, I think our children inspire me. I think, I have kids, and I think about the world that I would like them to inherit, and what it is that I believe that they're going to need to heal and flourish and evolve in that world, and what are the kinds of teachings and practices, initiatory processes that they will need to continue the work that we're doing. So I think it's that perspective of how being inspired to heal the multi-generational trauma that our planet is caught in, and to support the flourishing of a of a future unified planet. So I'm inspired by the big vision of a new time and a new Earth and our children.
I love that. Absolutely. So let's start with the whole planetary dharma. So could you maybe unpack or explain the concept of the planetary dharma and how it's relating to the global challenges we are all experiencing?
Right. So with any teaching, any kind of spiritual teaching, the first thing to look at is, well, what is the context that teaching is happening in? And the context is developmental. And what I mean by that is that as we evolve through time, our spiritual intelligence develops as well as our cognitive intelligence. So we're at a time where we need to appreciate and understand that our what appears to be personal spiritual journey is actually part of a planetary process. And that actually we're not going to be able to align with what our deepest design is if we don't understand that, because humanity serves a function within the evolution of the planetary intelligence itself. So we have to understand what a planet is as a spiritual being, that just like we have bodies, and chakras, the planet herself does too. And the heavens, so to speak, and those dimensions that we experience when we're disembodied, when we're disincarnate, these are the various other dimensions and tissues of her body. So the planet itself is going through an evolutionary process. Humanity forms part of the nervous system and the newest sphere, or if you will, the mental body of the planetary intelligence. And of course, that mental body is currently, well, it isn't unified, right? Humanity is not unified in the understanding of its function as a planet, as a kind of expression of planetary intelligence. So understanding spiritual practice as being something that serves the evolution of the whole, and that enlightenment or awakening is actually part of a much larger project, and that there's no kind of escaping our commitment to her evolution, and her evolution of course is ours. And the suffering that we see in humanity, the psychological suffering, the physical suffering, the cultural suffering, the ecological systemic suffering, all of these are various dimensions of humanity's inability to understand how we fit into a larger planetary system. So first thing, planetary Dharma is an appreciation of the necessity to develop a planetary consciousness and to understand that some of the advanced developmental traits, if you will, of ego development are actually planetary. They are the mind and the heart begin to, let's say, holographically become resonant with the planet as a whole system. In the Buddhist tradition, we would call that the level of a bodhisattva. And what I've been trying to do in my work is show how the bodhisattva, or if we use a Christian term, a Christ, right, is actually a kind of has a function, that we have a function psychologically and intuitively as part of a real world and a real world system, and not just some imaginal kind of mythic religious understanding of these concepts. So that's the planetary Dharma piece, right? Obviously, well, let me add a little bit more, but does that make sense?
Absolutely, it makes sense. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And would you think your listeners would have any like kind of questions around that piece of it? Is there anything that
So, as I was listening to you, John, I was just thinking about how do we become part of that unified field, right? And I always say that our environment is a reflection of our internal environment. So, if we look externally of the wars and what's going on, that's going on within ourselves. And so, when you're talking about the development phase, I wonder whether that's part of that whole ecosystem where we have to really dig deep to do that self work internally to be able to shift and support what's happening on the external surface. So
Yes.
that's what I was thinking as you were speaking through it.
Yeah, so on a very simple level, developmentally, if we use like an Eastern model of the chakras, let's say, um, humanity needs to evolve to the heart. And what we understand the in terms of the heart and its resonance, what we understand from the research done by the Heart Math Institute and other research is that our heart centers themselves magnetically at a magnetic level are in resonance with the planet itself. So the planet's electromagnetic field is communicating with our hearts the whole time, and vice versa. Uh, so we are quite literally wired into that unified field through the heart. And the heart has a magnetic capacity to it. Now, to the extent that we aren't doing that, which clearly a significant percentage of humanity isn't, that means that some shape or form, and we don't quite know the science yet, there is discord between the human heart and the energy field of the planet itself. Um, we have a lot to learn about our relationship with the planet. And I think it is my sense and the sense of many other fellow kind of explorers, if you will, is that actually our planet deeply responds to human consciousness. We are her children, so to speak. And a lot of the, aside from the kind of adolescent behavior that we've had with our planet, in terms of our planet looks like an adolescent's bedroom, right? Like trash everywhere, all sorts of, it's a mess. So aside from the fact that we are, that is a kind of an ethical issue, there's also the issue that the lack of resonance between humanity and the planet it also causes some of the planetary um, climate change processes that we see. So we are much more, it isn't just our technology that is toxic. It isn't just our gaseous kind of fumes. It's also that our consciousness is also affects the consciousness of the planet itself, which is something that that shamans throughout time have said. So in some ways, it's a ethical responsibility, right, to be heart-centered and to grow, in that it probably has a much greater influence on the stability of our planetary system than what we currently realize.
It's easier said than done. I see this in the how this loop that we all get stuck in. It's about getting into the heart center, allowing our heart to send to ourselves to actually feel, not think. I think we're too much in the head, but to feel. And then what we're actually feeling, because that's magnetic in itself, it's we're attracting. And so if we're lacking compassion and lacking love, and we're looking at the things that, hey, they're this way or they're that way, or there's this war and there's that war, we're actually projecting that into our field and we're getting caught up in the loop. And no wonder there's a discord between the alignment of us and the planet itself, because we're keeping ourselves locked into this loop. This is how I see it energetically.
Yeah, and obviously the loop is our multi-generational trauma, right? So it's not like it is the original sin, so to speak. The original sin that we inherit is the trauma from previous generations. And of course, that trauma manifests itself psychologically, it manifests itself kind of biochemically, culturally, and systemically, just in terms of like our financial system and the kind of ways that we organize our outer world. Um, the heart itself, when we get there, what's interesting about reaching the heart is then all further development kind of happens within that field. So the heart is not only a relational organ, but as you pointed out, it has a magnetism to it. And as that magnetism increases and deepens, it coheres the brain itself. And so as that coherence becomes deeper and deeper, the higher levels of adult cognitive development become expressions of how deeply the kind of toroidal intelligence of the heart has organized, to what depth has that organized the brain. The deeper it organizes the brain, the more sophisticated the cognitive capacity becomes. So that then it isn't just about getting to the heart because of its relational intelligence, it's also the full kind of heart cognition is holonic and fractal and has the kind of capacity to solve the complex solutions that we find ourselves in the world. So it's also actually a developmental like entrance to all the higher stages of ego development or the bodhisattva path or whatever way you want to describe what advanced kind of human capacity is.
So how do we get, so when you're talking about development, what is a I guess, because I know there's different development phases that you speak about, and I'd love to really unpack that. Like, how do we get into that self-development so that we can become more coherent with the planet and with those around us? Because I know that the more coherent we become within our own self, the more we can create quite, I call it magic in our world.
Well, I think magic is what the heart can do. Um, and I'm going to just speak to that actually. The synchronicity, I think when you mean magic, you mean synchronicity. So,
Absolutely.
so the planet itself, it also has these sheaths. So you could say that the heart is a field, a personal field, but of course the planet also has the same field. Um, Now that field, that dimension of the noosphere of the kind of the heart mind field of the planet, or what the ancient alchemists would call the anima mundi, the soul of the world, that anima mundi is in resonance with your soul. And so when you experience synchronicity, what's happening is the soul, your own soul, and the ensouled intelligence of Gaia Sophia herself are beginning to become coherent. And that's when she, so to speak, is able to make synchronicity happen. So, to the extent that that becomes less of a state and more of a trait, as it becomes a trait, not only does synchronistic activity happen in your life, the right person, the right book, but as you go deeper, the mind itself begins to become synchronistic. And by that, I mean that the mind itself begins to become an expression of synchronicity, because just like everything, it is arising in this larger field. So to answer your question, which was like, well, how do we go about doing this, right? Well, I mean, obviously, there's a number of dynamics that we need to understand, and those dynamics then need to be enacted simultaneously. Um, Clearly, there is healing work that needs to happen. So we all have a bunch of cleaning up or integrative work that needs to happen in terms of cleaning up the past and how we're fused with our childhood object relations, our childhood traumas, and the process of individuating and becoming more and more of an individual and differentiating from our childhood is one of those dynamics, right? The becoming a true individual, because you can't actually, but you don't want to become part of the unified field before you're a differentiated individual, because if you do that, there's going to be conflict between like, well, kind of the need for differentiation and individuation and the need for fusion, if that makes sense, right?
100%.
Right. So we all have our psychological work to do, right? So that's super important. And then there is the kind of a awakening process, and then the growing up process, and how those two interrelate with one another. So if we talk about the growing up process first, there's all kinds of developmental theorists, right? Developmental psychology has been a really important part of Western psychology for 100 years, whether it's Piaget or whether it's Lovinger or any of these developmental theorists. What we understand is that the human psyche unfolds developmentally. And of course, if our culture really knew that, we would have a very different culture. Unfortunately, people don't know that. But one shorthand way of thinking about how we unfold is first person, second person, third person, fourth person perspective, meaning when we're an infant, we're just fused narcissist, and then we kind of develop a sense of I and thou, and we develop second person concrete operational cognition. Are you in or are you out? Are you part of my clan or are you not part of my clan? Kind of fundamentalist cognition. And then as we mature, we develop third person perspective, which is really objectivity, right? So you and I can agree that there's something there that is objective, right? So the achievement of objectivity is, I mean, frankly, some people are still trying to get that, right? Um, Fourth person perspective, if you will, is the ability to kind of see context. So if we think of these as different phases in terms of history, we have the kind of traditional, we have like the kind of magical, early kind of first person, second person phase of our world history, kind of magical, where we were still, pretty fused with nature. When we get to kind of second person, we're moving into kind of traditional the pre-modern traditional world, kind of traditional medieval Europe, for instance. And as we move into rationality, we move into modernity, third person. And then as we move into fourth person, we move into post-modernity with all of its kind of relativistic, contextual ways of thinking. And then you got fifth person. Fifth person is basically hierarchical cognition, the ability to understand, oh, we evolve hierarchically, like we unfold. And once we get to that place, we begin to realize, oh wow, I have all of these parts inside of me. I have a part of me that's really primitive. I have a part of me that's a magical child. I have a part of me that is a um, traditional, ethical kind of what's my code dimension. I have a part of me that's a rational scientist. I have a part of me that's a hippie. Let's sit in a circle and we'll share our feelings. And all of those layers are super important, right? And getting to fifth person perspective is I mean, only probably 1% of the population of our planet is even at that point. And what's important about that is that allows also for you to begin to realize, oh my gosh, there's a whole path above, as well as all of that below that you and I have gone through. I mean, we go through these stages the first 20-25 years of our life, and then we just kind of stabilize. So that growing up dimension is important, and it has a certain it is cognitive in some ways, and cognitive here doesn't necessarily mean thinking. It just means perspective taking. Like, how many facets does the diamond have? The more complex the diamond, if you will, the more beautiful it can become because the more light it can reflect inside of itself. So that's the kind of growing up process um, that kind of unfolds. And in some ways, that's very similar to how the Buddhists conceive of the bodhisattva. The bodhisattva, we all need to grow up because in order to respond to the challenges of the world, we need to find the solutions, right? If we don't find the solutions, then who else is going to do that? So in that sense, there's a kind of an ethical dimension of like, hey, you need to grow up and become an adult. And then the awakening dynamic, if you will, which is the kind of third dynamic, is really got to do with fundamentally the ability to kind of let go of all structures and to recognize first and then stabilize the unbounded heart-mind field of kind of unified consciousness. Now, awakening by itself, the problem with awakening by itself is always going to be interpreted by the level of development that you're at. So what that means is if you could teach, somebody who is completely self-absorbed awakening techniques, and yes, they would become realized, but if they're still, let's say, running Windows 2.0, they're still going to interpret everything from Windows 2.0 perspective, and not Windows 3.0 or 4.0, 5.0. So awakening itself in the traditions, in the Buddhist tradition, the meditative dimension, the spiritual dimension wasn't actually, it was recognized that that wasn't enough. You needed a cognitive dimension of growing up and understanding how to apply this kind of unified um, state of consciousness, if you will. How was that relevant to our relationships and to the world? So those three dimensions, the kind of the cleaning up our psychological baggage that we all have, the growing up and becoming more mature, and the awakening dimension, those are the three dimensions that we're all somewhat engaged in, consciously or unconsciously, at any moment in time.
Wow, lots of things going through my mind at the moment as you were explaining that, and thank you very much for explaining that. It's almost like there's these different levels of dimensions, and that humanity, from what I'm hearing, because you were saying the fifth development phase, there's like that 1%er. Does that mean from a collective, we're kind of stuck between the three stages? Is
Yes,
that what I'm hearing? Yeah.
yeah, what you see is the cultural war. So before one is able to have an appreciation of hierarchical development, and remember what hierarchy means is sacred order. Hierarchy has had a bad rap, but actually our spiritual nature unfolds hierarchically, right? So think of that as a sacred process, not some sort of power over, right? Which is how we've equated the term hierarchy. But if you look at what's happened in our culture and our civilization, and I'm not sure about Australia, but I'm sure it's probably pretty similar, you have a conflict between the kind of traditionalists. So maybe these will be your kind of conservative Christians, your modernists. So these are your kind of entrepreneurial capitalist, and your postmodern woke um, kind of progressives. And these three, they each think the other is nuts, right? And so this is the culture war that we see. We see modernity in the middle of the two. And particularly in the United States, but I think we see this throughout the Western psyche, is this band of the psyche outside, but it's also inside. So this will be our kind of like religious, code-oriented, and there's a lot of goodness in that. I think the thing is we've got to understand there's a lot of good that comes from traditionalism. It's not all like, not all the Spanish Inquisition, right? There's a lot of value, like intrinsic sense of value and things that are worth sacrificing for, right? Like family values in the best sense, right? So that's the traditional. Then you have that modern, which is the kind of strategic, capitalist, highly individualistic. And then you have that postmodern, kumbaya, woke, communal consciousness, and they're all fighting. And of course, the truth is they're all right. They just haven't yet been integrated, right, in a psyche that actually values each of those stages of development. If you have a kid and you see the kid going through these stages, it's not like, oh, this is, I'm sorry, you're at stage 2. This is a problem. Now you're at stage 3. Oh, that's great. We appreciate every stage and that they're valuable for growth, right? So yes, that's where we see the as you would say it, the inner being expressed out in the outer world, and the lack of integration
Mm.
and the kind of chaos that we have and culture war.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you were talking about those different parts because they are all reside within us, and if we get triggered by any of those external parts, I mean, they all play a role. It's that's where we need to lean into. That's the work that we need to integrate, I think, to become whole. The one thing that keeps playing in my mind is how do we make these shifts? Because I always think I'm French. I was born in France, so of course red wine is very dear to my heart. And I always, we say you don't put a good red wine into an old bottle. And so, yes, is all this trauma, whether it's ancestral, psychological. How do we make these shifts without giving death to oneself? It's almost like I always saw it as you need to give death to oneself to be able to be a new self, almost like a new bottle of wine, if that
Mm,
makes sense. If I'm trying to, what I'm trying, so what we're saying was trying to making these changes within this current ecosystem here, the old bottle. Um,
mhm,
but how do we do that knowing there's these deep wounds and these ancestral trauma that we carry unconsciously, not even consciously aware of them, but knowing that we have to do this development into individual development work to help with the planetary dharma, the expansion that's taking place.
mm, mm. So your question is how do we dissolve and reconstitute at the same time?
Beautiful. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So that's where the higher structural stages come in. So in Buddhist, so in Buddhist psychology, and I'll use the term Buddhist here to really just refer to, let's say, the contemplative technology of the planet. And arguably, the Buddhists have the most advanced tech, so we just use the term Buddhism to reflect any high-tech contemplative practices. Um, at least that's how I'm going to use it right now. So the how to put this? In order to recognize the the fundamental open ground of being, once we start to recognize that, then we're no longer identified with any of the structures in consciousness. So to the extent that you are beginning to experience that you have a self, but you're not the self. So to the extent that you're beginning to experience more and more that your basis of operation is shifting from being identified with a self structure to being identified with the field itself. So, in the higher tier of development, that is kind of the first stage. So, first, you have to learn how to access that in the contemplative space. So, that's like, how do you first calm the mind down enough? That would be the first stage. But then, once you calm the mind down, how, the practices of looking into the inherent openness of the field of experience. So once the mind is calmed, then you have the ability to see that the apparent structures that appear to be so solid, let's say the body, the limits of the body, are actually just constructions. And actually, if you look deep in the contemplative space, you begin to discover that the body is a fundamentally open field. Right? So the first thing is you begin to experience that as a state. Okay. But what I mean by a state is you have a formal practice, you go and meditate, right? You calm things down, you calm down, then and then you open and you're like, oh. So that's the first stage. However, it's only a state, which means you can't operate your self structure and that openness at the same time. So at the beginning, there's a kind of you're going backwards and forwards. And that part of the journey can be a little crazy making because it's like on one hand, you're kind of experiencing more and more this field like sense of connection. On another hand, you can't experience that when the self is doing its yap, 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 right? Okay. So as that becomes more stable, so as that ability becomes more and more of a trait, so you can think of that in terms of neuroplasticity. So as that state has got wired in more and more and more, it so that you no longer have to do anything, it can just be there. Yeah. Then the next thing is you can reintroduce the mind, the self, back into that field. So now you have this wider field. You can reintroduce the thought process and the self process, but now the self is kind of translucent. It's in this wider field of being. So then, since you're not identified with the self structure, but you can also, at the same time you are it, it's a paradox. Now you can begin to essentially rebuild it as you're still deconstructing. So as you keep recognizing that there's nothing intrinsic, it's all just emptiness, it's all openness, it's all light, then you can begin to simultaneously like, okay, well, how do I want to rebuild this self? What is the optimal self structure? And because the self is not holding on because awareness is no longer fused to the self, therefore it's open, therefore it's much more malleable, and you can begin to redesign, so to speak, the self structure. So the contemplative dimension is necessary in all development beyond fifth person perspective. So in that sense, there is no further development without the kind of contemplative capacity or the meditative capacity to recognize and then stabilize the unified field, for want of a better term. I mean, obviously these terms are
I love it.
interchangeable.
I'm having a bit of a smirk on my face because I've been meditating for years, and I love the experience in the moment, that blissfulness, that sense of, um, sense of being all and nothing at the same time. I love that.
Yeah,
However, you get into your day and out of that state. And
that's right.
but I love the fact you turn it into a trait. And I think, well, obviously, this is still my practice, even though I do it on a daily practice. I need to look at how do I turn this into a trait. Absolutely. Have I seen the magic unfold over the years? And this is before we came on the show, some of the things that I'm becoming more and more aware of. But it is a practice. It's not it doesn't happen automatically. It's one of those things that you have to be consciously aware, because it's easy to go on autopilot and completely forget about what just took place half an hour ago where you felt so blissful.
Yes.
Mm.
So,
How
so
do you
maybe
do
what
it?
would be, well, so maybe what would be interesting is to explore what is the dynamic that you would need to understand in order to make this a permanent trait, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So the first thing is you have to be able to meditate 20, like 24/7, so to speak, with your eyes open. What I mean is the eye consciousness is is a central like component of I, me, I, right? So you have to be able to stabilize that unified mind with the eyes open. Now, the thing about so most people sit with their eyes shut. The thing about the eye consciousness is it's very precise, meaning it's like the kinesthetic consciousness, touchy-feely, it's a little bit vague, right? But eye consciousness is pretty like clear and clean. It's like, no, I see you. That isn't what's going on. Look, it's that. So the understanding of the mechanisms that stabilize and make this a trait have to be very clear. If you don't clearly understand them, then you won't be able to stabilize them. So that's the first. So first thing is it has to happen with the eyes open, A, and B, you have to have a very good, clear cognitive understanding of what the mechanism is. Now, to make it really simple, let's talk about, let's say, three main structures. Let's talk about the attention, the self, and awareness. Yeah, I mean, we all gotta say, okay. So let's first talk about attention. Within contemplative science, it's understood that the seed of dysfunction, the seed of it, is when awareness. So let's imagine awareness is this Zoom screen I have here. That's the field, right? When awareness becomes fused with the attention. The attention is the paranoid monkey, right? So attention, if you think of the attention, it is wired into the attention is the fundamental, right, survival mechanism. What was that, right? So the attention is also like the kind of the deeper aspect, if you will, of the self structure. Why? Well, the self is glued together by the attention. What it is that you attend to in the self structure is whatever dimension of the self that's uploaded in this moment, right? So you don't have a self unless you're attending to various dimensions of it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And therefore, what causes the grab around the self is the attention that is constantly holding onto the various dimensions of the self that are coming up in our experience. Okay. Um, and obviously, awareness isn't the same thing as the self structure, and that isn't the same thing as the attentional system. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So the self system is always in cahoots with the attentional system. So what that means is, let's say as we're on the screen with one another right now, like if I look at you, that's my attentional system, right? Narrowing down, right? There's Catherine. Okay. That's when the moment I do that, the self structure is now operating through the attentional system. However, I'm also seeing the whole room at the same time, right? Like you're looking at me, I'm looking at you, but you're not necessarily consciously looking at the whole room. That's because you weren't consciously aware of the whole field. Awareness is always global. And by that, I mean it always saturates an entire field. So we could say visual awareness is a single field. If you break that single field, that is the attentional system. And when you break it, along comes the self structure. So what does that mean? It means you have to learn to maintain and stabilize the ability to see the whole thing. So if you do this right now, you see the whole room and specifically engage with me at the same time. Now, when you do that, it decenters, it defuses, if we use a term from ACT, it defuses the operating system from the attentional system. So you're operating now from this wider field, and yet you're still engaging your attentional system and therefore able to think and able to respond. But to the extent that you're able to stabilize that wider field, you are that wider field. You are how you see. So if you're seeing through like this, and most people go their whole day through, here's my cup of coffee, here's my, like, here's this, here's this, here's this, here's this. It's not that panoramic awareness. Does that does that make sense as a mechanism?
100% makes sense, because a lot of the times if I'm feeling not centered or a little bit frazzled, I ask myself the question, where am I? And quite often I'm out here, like too focused on external stuff. And so all I need to do is I practice dropping into my heart as often as possible. But what you speak about is becoming more of the observer as often as possible. So you're seeing the field be the field. You're actually, well, the way I see it is being the field within the field, and then being
Yes.
able to see what's happening at this level.
So then we add one more piece is that awareness is the heart. So the heart has both the capacity to feel the wholeness, which is the beginning. The next stage is it has the capacity to see the wholeness. Now that includes ideally the feeling, but the seeing aspect now means that now there is more intelligence. Obviously, you don't just want the seeing aspect, you want the feeling field aspect as well. But in some of the traditions, in some of the advanced, they'll talk about how the heart center has channels that go up to the eyes that bypass the brain. And so when you're looking and you're seeing through that lens of wholeness, that is how the heart sees. And once you stabilize that, so imagine that you kind of stabilize how the heart sees. What then begins to happen is thought begins to change, because this way of holding your experience isn't just, we're not just seeing an outer world out there. What we're doing is we're actually relating to, we're learning to just relate to phenomena. And by shifting that basis of operation, we begin to shift our relationship with thought itself. And as we begin to shift our relationship with thought, and you're staying grounded in this heart mind that is resonant with the field of the planet itself, then the thoughts begin to become synchronistic, and your consciousness begins to become planetary. Like literally, the mind literally starts to think in different ways. that is just that simple.
I
Does that
love that. I do. You've just given me a different perspective. So in our coaching academy, we talk about listening with the heart, and you can hear very different words are spoken when somebody listens with the heart. I quite often ask myself, what would my heart say in this situation? But not what would my heart see. So you've given me a completely different dimension right now. So thank you for that.
Mm.
I love the fact that you shared that with me, because now I've never looked at it that way. John, I'm also very conscious of your time, and I do have one question, but is there anything that you would like to, what we just spoke about before I ask you about the fourth turning, which is something I did want to unpack a little bit?
No, that's good.
No? Okay.
No, yeah.
Okay, so I love that. So thank you for that little gold nugget. Love that. So I'm going to start looking at what is my heart seeing. So before we came on the show, I was sharing with you. I really want to unpack what exactly is the fourth turning, and we did talk a little bit about the different fourth turning from a not from a Buddhist perspective, which is what I'd really like to understand today.
Well, from the perspective of, let's say, Buddhist contemplative science, there have been three prior paradigms of contemplative science. Um, these are three different practice vehicles based on different ways of thinking, really. Um, the first one, what's called the individual vehicle, you could think of that as very much based on the logic of cause and effect. And then the second turning is based more on systemic thinking. And let's say the third, you could say, is maybe based more on meta-systemic thinking, meaning how you look at a problem and what kind of intelligence you bring to it will resolve in different kinds of solutions. So you can think of Buddhism as a technology that evolves as your capacity evolves. And we all start with the first one because that kind of cause and effect thinking is really about addressing, let's say, trauma. Trauma happened in the past, and how do you address it? So the point of the fourth turning, um, which is not something that Buddhism traditionally talks about, but there was a great British historian of civilizations who isn't too popular these days because times change, but called Toynbee. And Toynbee, I think he said that the most important event of the 20th century was the Dharma or Buddhism coming to the West. So this was a rather stuffy kind of, well, British historian. Why the hell is he saying that the biggest event of the 20th century is Buddhism coming to the West? Well, it's because wherever Buddhism has gone, and again, Buddhism here, we're referring to all of these psychotechnologies. Let's include yoga and kind of Hindu yoga and Taoist yoga and all of that. And let's just say it's kind of like Buddhistic culture. And Buddhist here, I mean awakening, the term awakening, awakening technologies. Well, when these awakening technologies come to a new civilization, the new civilization adds what it is that they have that is part of this project of alleviating suffering and evolving humanity. So these technologies have now probably been here for, more than 50 years. And so something is going to be happening. So when I talk about, and not just myself, but other colleagues talk about the fourth turning, we're talking about what is that new synthesis. Now, the first thing to say is that the fourth turning, um, in some ways, in my mind, it completes because now it's East and West coming together, so to speak. Um, the fourth, well, let's talk about it synchronistically. So I'm going to use the term the fourth over and over and over and over again. I'm going to okay, so what's the fourth chakra? The heart chakra. What is the chakra, heart chakra, in resonance with? The planetary field. What is the fourth dimension? Time. The fourth turning is also about understanding the nature of sacred time, which is also, interestingly, what Strauss and Howe were talking about when they were talking about generational pieces. So the fourth turning is also related to understanding the nature of sacred time. Now we can look at that all different kinds of ways. So we can look at sacred time in terms of understanding the whole life cycle. That's the time. That is a whole journey. We can look at sacred time in terms of understanding the brain states related to meditation technologies, right? So when we did research on the various meditative stages of development, they were measured in hertz. Well, what's hertz? Timing, right? If we begin to understand that the language of the sacred is the language of harmonics, is the language of music, and that timing, that there's harmony, that there's timing that is resonant and timing that isn't resonant, we begin to kind of realize that, oh, there's a whole language here around timing, which helps us integrate all the various fields. So the other thing about the fourth turning is integrates the four dimensions, if you will, of the kind of psychological with the biochemical, with the cultural, with the systemic. Those are the four perspectives, if you will, four integral perspectives. So the fourth turning is also realizing, oh, we unfold in all of those four dimensions. The fourth turning is also related to the understanding of planetary history, planetary cycles. The story that we've been told from the perspective of the traditions as to how long we've been here and how long we've been at it might not be the full story. So the whole science of cycles, and by cycles we mean like that human cycles of evolution and the loss of civilizations, that part of our avoidance of even looking at that is because we don't want to look at the fact that our civilization could die. So we want to see ourselves as the most important. The idea that other civilizations could have risen and then completely disappeared is a little difficult for an ego that isn't willing to acknowledge its impermanence. So the fourth turning is also what we would call in Sanskrit Kala Chakra, or time wheel. Now, the time wheel in the Buddhist tradition, the Kala Chakra, is the most sophisticated tantric technology of the Buddhists. So there is both a Tibetan time wheel, but there is also a planetary time wheel. By Tibetan, I mean, well, the Tibetan calendar, just like there was the Mayan calendar, right? I mean, this understanding of the nature of time and sacred time arises in various cultures. However, this is the first time that it's arisen within, at least the first time that we're aware of, that it's arisen within a planetary civilization. And therefore, an understanding of time that can include all those prior kind of understandings of time and timing. So what's important there is when we begin to understand sacred time, we'll also begin to understand maybe some of the very deep traumas that are in the human psyche. Let's say if as a human species, if we have gone through major cataclysms, which when we look at some of the evidence that's coming out there on kind of alternative archaeology, my sense is what is alternative archaeology 20, 30 years from now will be quite well integrated. It has to be. But, as we understand that more, then maybe we begin to appreciate, oh, one of the reasons why we have so much baggage is because we've been through a lot as a species. And if we've been through, and we've not only that, we've been here a lot longer. We're not just a 10,000 year project, right? We've been here a lot longer. And I think all of those pieces begin to open up a much more kind of cosmological understanding of who we are that places us in a larger story of sacred time, that places us on within a sacred planet, so to speak, and that sacred planet right now is about to go through a massive transition. And in order to be okay with that massive transition, you have to be okay with death. Because no matter whether that death, well, even if that death is metaphorical, the psyche does not relate to it as if it's metaphorical, right? That's not how our psyches work. Our psyches are like, oh, death is death. So in order to make the kind of transition to the world that you and I and our listeners, like, we know that there's something possible. I like to think of, planet as university, right? Planet as a work of art. So to get from where we are right now, and people be like, oh, he's being naive, but to get from where we are now to where the planet needs us to be. You see, from the perspective of a planet, the planet needs to be a university because that's what it is from the planet's perspective. So that gap, we're here, and let's say within 300 years, but we've got to make a journey, so to speak. I mean, I think the journey metaphor has always been a part of the spiritual path. If it doesn't put a demand on you, if we think that the heroine's journey or the hero's journey is just a metaphor, well, everything is just a metaphor, right? Like actually, it involves a real journey going from one place to a new place in the future that we've never been to. And it involves facing the shadow, the collective shadow of empire, and all that kind of journey that we're like, oh, let's keep that psychological. Well, what the fourth training says, well, no, it's not psychological. I'm sorry, is like, we need to go through this. We're going to die no matter what. So the choice is do we like transform? Is it a metaphorical death, if that makes sense, right? Or are we scared and we can't make that transition and we can't evolve to these higher levels of development, for want of a better term, and therefore that the possibility for evolution of this cycle closes down, and the planet itself has to wait, I don't know, few 100,000 or even million years until we get it back up to speed again. So those are some of the kind of dimensions of the fourth turning. I mean, really, I'll just keep going. Sorry,
Oh, I
but it's
love it. Keep going.
yeah. Again, let me talk the importance of the heart, like the fourth training of the heart piece here, and the path of the bodhisattva, or the path of a Christ. So the path of the bodhisattva, or path of a Christ, is an engaged practice, an engaged path, which means if we really understand that we live in a non-dual world, it means actually your inner psyche and your outer psyche are one. It's a single field. Then what that means is what arises in your life is also arising within the psyche. It's inner and outer are one. So as we were talking about, as the heart becomes more compassionate, and as you become more motivated to serve that vision, the heart field gets more and more resonant, right? Becomes stronger and stronger. As it becomes stronger, the anima mundi, the soul of the world, the synchronistic intelligence, of the planet starts drawing to you those circumstances that are necessary, for you to become the kind of person that you need to become in order for us to make that world together. So those dynamisms, the dynamism of synchronicity, is really about the fourth turning. And it's also like appreciating that actually the journey now, we've got to a point in the journey where it's like a in the kind of hero, in the kind of a superhero movie where, yes, the individual heroes have to come together and there becomes a group hero. That's also kind of the one of the dimensions of this fourth turning, is that we realize that what we know from, let's say, the research with the Maharishi TM research is that there is a Maharishi effect, if you will, that there are morphogenic fields generated by meditators. But those meditators need to be in coherence, right? So obviously the TM people have done their own research, and so people are always a little hesitant because it's like, well, it's the TM researchers doing their own research. Yes, but the research is pretty conclusive in my mind that square root of 1% of the population, they go into a city and they start doing their meditation, the crime rate's just lower. However, they leave and the crime rates go back up. And I think part of that is because TM is calibrated too high energetically. So yes, it affects the field, but it isn't engaging the healing dynamics necessary to permanently transform the field. So part of the fourth turning is also the integration into the contemplative technology. What if we understood how to, let's say, in those kind of coherent meditative states, actually address some of the early, let's say, attachment wounding? Because if you understand the causes of suffering from a Western psychological perspective, you understand a lot of it is like early childhood. So the problem with the great traditions is they didn't study that. They studied like advanced states. However, what the fourth turning shows you is actually there's a relationship between the advanced states and the early childhood injuries. And when you redesign the contemplative practices, that you're taking the force of the meditation and helping to heal that, like those very early injuries. Imagine what happens when you do that in the unified field, that you're not just kind of creating higher states in the unified field, but you're also creating inherently integrative states that help the psyche, the human psyche on a planetary level, kind of integrate a lot of the trauma that we haven't been able to process, and that spirituality, so to speak, hasn't been able to touch because it's been too high.
I love the way that you described that. And some of the stuff that you just explained, we had Greg Braden and Lynn McTaggart that spoke very much about some of the things that you just shared with us. So from my understanding, I mean, and we did, I love the fact you talked about Strauss and Howes, because the fourth turning, from my understanding, we're right in the midst of crisis. And so what I'm hearing is there's this upheaval that is taking place, but the transformation really starts from within ourselves to shift, to be more coherent and aligned with what's taking place. It's almost like to dissolve or diffuse what's taking place, but it starts doing that deep work, that individual development stuff that you talk about. When you're talking about the meditation, you're talking about, because I know you do is it Mahamudra meditation?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that, is that all a heart-centered meditation?
No, I was trained in Mahamudra and Dzogchen, which are traditional Buddhist contemplative approaches, and taught those for many years. However, every technology evolves from a particular level of understanding what the application of that technology is. So my work has been, how do those technologies need to be updated in such a way that they are aligned with what it is I've just said? That doesn't mean changing all of them. I mean, an airplane, you might change from like having props to having jets. So yes, I mean, I don't teach those approaches anymore, although all of that is enfolded into how I teach now. But those teachings were designed for a particular culture at a particular time. And so what the fourth turning is saying is we need to develop new contemplative technologies for the demands that we face in this time.
And it is an interesting time of that with all the AI stuff. But I am looking at the time and being conscious of your time. So, John, we might
Uh-huh.
have to ask you to come back on the show. Uh, so, the way that we wrap up the show, John, we always wrap up asking our guests to leave 3 shiny golden nuggets for our guests. So, what would be those 3 shiny golden nuggets for our listeners, our viewers, our audience?
Well, I think the first one has been that our heart is not just is the center of our spiritual intelligence. And so, yes, there's a feeling intelligence to the heart, but the heart it has a seeing intelligence. So I think the first thing is recognizing how important that is, and that simply throughout the day beginning to practice like that wider that wider way of seeing the world, that is seeing beauty, right? So that wider, it's not just about spacing out. That's not, it's about actually seeing beauty. Heart is the center of intelligence, seeing beauty. I think the second piece is appreciating that the heart field is in resonance with the earth and the intelligence of what's happening and arising. So if our listeners really believed that was true and really had confidence in that intelligence, what's it like to live in that knowing that your heart is in communication with the field of the earth and every other human being is too? And what is it that you want to be communicating to us? What do we want to be communicating to one another? So I think that there's that piece. And I think the last piece is just remembering that as humans, development is our birthright, right? And at this moment in history, that is like imperative for even our survival as a species, right? And that we're going to be going on a journey. We're going to be going on a journey. And, to start getting ready for the fact that you're going to be going on a journey and to start realizing that the GPS for that journey is going to be the heart in resonant with the planet itself. But if we want to have the world that our hearts truly know is possible, then we have to be willing to make that pilgrimage, or we'll be forced to just by the virtue of how things are going to unfold. So I hope those are 3 little nuggies.
I love them. I love them. And when you were talking about the second one about the heart and the coherence with the earth, I just had a question drop in. What is it that we need to let go of? So it's not so much about is it that I need to attain, is what do we need to let go of to bring that openness that we all need to experience in this time. John, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. I love everything that you shared. I'm sure our tribe will reach out. We'll have everything in the show notes. Where do you hang out the most?
Literally. But here in Boulder, Colorado.
Okay. Okay. We'll have everything in the show notes. I know you have Instagram. I saw that you just had a retreat as well. So for
Yeah,
our
Howard, I will be offering an intro to Planetary Dharma later this fall. We've had folks from Australia come and attend that live, but people also can purchase the retreat and then do the retreat asynchronistically. So that if they're interested, in that, that's the next offering, and then we probably have a new cohort beginning on our multi-year program that will probably begin in the new year. We do have some Australian folks who have been part of that in the past, and all that information is on planetaryDharma.com.
We'll have
Yeah,
that in the show notes. Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you so much for your time, your energy, and your wealth of wisdom. Thank you so much.
thank you, Catherine. Really appreciate being here with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.